Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start with the second session of the Dublin Economic Workshop 2020. My name is Jasmina Behan. I'm your host for today. I'm from the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. So while it is not the same having due online and not in Wexford this year, being online allowed us to have more people tune in and join our discussions on policy challenges. And today's session is recorded and it will be available online from tomorrow. So I would ask you to participate by asking questions through the Q&A function that you have on Zoom. And we will then go through those questions after the presentations as part of the discussion with the panelists. So first, I would like to thank the Dublin Economic Workshop Committee for organizing this year's event with such a good lineup. I would also like to thank Dublin Chamber for sponsoring the event and also to the speakers and those attending. So I hope that we have another good session today following a very engaging session on housing yesterday. Today we're talking about the challenges facing the Irish labour market. So earlier this year, we went in a matter of days from full employment to having over half of the workforce on income supports. It became obvious from the early days that shutting down the economy will have a major impact on household and enterprise liquidity. And to buffer the impact on households, we moved swiftly from relying on the existing automatic stabilizer mechanisms to introducing two new income support schemes, the pandemic unemployment payment and the temporary wage subsidy scheme. And between the live register and those two schemes, we had the income of over 1 million people supported by the state at the peak of the crisis. So since we started reopening the economy under the roadmap phases, people started returning back to work. And this is obviously good news, but the recovery in the labour market is not as fast as one would hope for, and added to that is the long shadow of Brexit ahead of us. So between pandemic and Brexit, we're likely to see elevated unemployment numbers for some time. And we face a risk of entrenched long-term unemployment and permanent scars in some segments of the labour market, such as people who are working in the impacted sectors, but also youth over 55s, low-skilled, and those based in rural areas. So the session today will focus on the size and the nature of this challenge, and also the discussion around what we can do about it. So we will start with the presentation from Cathal McDermott. Cathal works in the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. As a policy analyst, he has worked on a number of policy areas, but most recently his work focused on COVID-19 and its impact on the economy, the labour market and the sectors. Prior to joining IGEES, Cathal worked as a policy analyst on income tax policy in HR Treasury and Revenue and Customs in the UK. So without further ado, over to you, Cathal.
Thanks, Jasmina. Just going to share my screen. Okay. So, hi everybody. First off, thanks Jasmina, and thanks to the Dublin Economic Workshop Committee for the opportunity to present some of the work that we've been doing in the IGEES unit in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform recently around COVID-19 and its economic impacts. So really what I'm going to do in the next 10 or 12 minutes or so is a bit of a high level piece. It's kind of to set up the context around the income support measures which Jasmina mentioned, and then to look at the speed at which they were brought in and which people moved onto these schemes. We'll then use the data to look at the evolution of the numbers in those schemes as the economy reopened and get a sense of where we're at and how we've got there. The detail will be discussed more in the following presentations in terms of the types of people who are now on the PUP, and the expenditure on the PUP and the movements between the PUP and the TWSS. So yeah, for a high level overview, let's start. So just the ordering of the presentation here. I'm going to discuss a little bit to introduce it. Then we'll take a look at the temporary income support measures and the enterprise supports briefly. You're able to use the data around these schemes to look at the real-time immediate impact of COVID-19 on the labour market, which is quite new. You know, we couldn't have such timely information in previous recessions and times of hardship for the labour market. And then we'll take a look at the economic role of the sectors within the economy. So, you know, you've got the labour market impacts, but more recently, you know, we're seeing data around GDP and the income tax take, which are slightly different from the data we're seeing on the employment market. So just to continue, so I know Daniel O'Callaghan, who's also an IGEES analyst, presented yesterday in the housing session and introduced the concept of IGEES, but just for people who are tuning in for the first time today. So IGEES was introduced in 2012 with the idea of making evidence and analysis more prominent in public policy. So analysts all around the 17 government departments. It's a network of around 200 analysts doing lots of varied work. There is an IGEES website there, igis.gov.ie, where you can see the range of work. So yeah, I belong to this network, working in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. So a lot of people will have heard of these, but I just wanted to go over them, and in case anyone isn't so familiar with them. So we have the temporary income support measures, which were introduced rapidly to deal with the economic impact of COVID-19, particularly the effect on people's income. So we have the pandemic unemployment payment, which has been introduced since March 13th at a flat rate of deal with the economic impact of COVID. It's now a dual rate to account for people's pre-COVID earnings. So for instance, where pre-COVID earnings are less than 200, before COVID, it's a lower rate now. The July stimulus laid out the next steps with the pandemic unemployment payment. So you can see there in the table, there are changes due in September, February, and then April. Changes due in September, February, and then 2021 actually. The temporary wage subsidy scheme is a related scheme, but here the idea was the link between the employee and employer would be maintained, and the government would provide a percentage of the net weekly wage. So initially that was set at 70% with a maximum contribution of €410 per week. And again, there were some changes to that. It was introduced quite quickly, so there were some changes to kind of ensure a bit more equity. And the temporary wage subsidy scheme will shortly transition into the employment wage subsidy scheme, which is more of and with the temporary wage subsidy scheme, I should say, there are eligibility criteria around the impact on turnover. So the temporary wage subsidy scheme is 25%. Just briefly, it's not as important as the other ones. It hasn't been used as much, but there was an enhanced illness benefit payment of $350 per week, which you would get following a COVID diagnosis. I'm not going to touch on these too much, but I do want to mention them. So, you know, we have those income supports, which these presentations will deal with in more detail, but it's also important to think about the enterprise supports. So, you know, these are designed to assist the enterprise base. So indirectly, they will assist the employment market, the labour market. The more of our enterprise base that can be kept going through the effect of the pandemic, obviously, the more employment you will have. So you have in things like the commercial rates waiver, the Restart grant, liquidity supports, tax deferrals and warehousing, and specific sectoral measures. So most recently to deal with the localized lockdowns in the Midlands and the extended lockdown measures for pubs, wet pubs. So I think it's important just to note those and their role in supporting the labour market. So here is a very high level overview over time of what's happened with these income supports. So we have the live register included here, along with the pandemic unemployment payment and the temporary wage subsidy scheme. And I guess what's striking about this is the speed came into place. So we can see already there in early April that there are over 920,000 people moving on to these supports, with a peak in early May of over 1.3 million people on the supports. And what we can see more recently is, following reopening of sectors of the economy, according to the roadmap, that this has started to decline. So there are now around just over 855,000 people being supported through these measures. This is mostly driven by a decrease in the numbers being supported by the pandemic unemployment payment. Although, as we'll see in the later presentations, there are quite complex movements between some of these schemes, so particularly the PUP and the TWSS, the Temporary Wage Subsidy Scheme. In this graph here, we can see the red line, the Temporary Wage Subsidy Scheme. The numbers being supported through that, they appear to be quite static, around the 400,000 mark. But what you'll have in there is a lot of flux in and out of the Temporary Wage Subsidy Scheme. So out into non-supported employment and in from the pandemic. So I think Orlagh will be going through that in a bit more detail later on. So just to note for the moment. So we spent a lot of time looking at the sectoral impact of the pandemic on different sectors. So, we have the overall impact, but the data, real-time data, can be used to break down the different sectors. So I've taken the data from the peak of the impact, which was back in early May. So this is when the broad lockdown measures were in place. And we can see that there's quite a different impact here across the sectors. So accommodation and food is the most impacted sector. So that is 90% of that sector estimated to have moved on to the PUP or the temporary wage subsidy scheme. So we're using the labour force survey here to get the denominator. So the people in these sectors who are estimated to be in employment in Q4 2019. Construction is the next most affected sector. So 81% of the sector were estimated to have moved on to these two income supports. It's quite interesting to look at industry here. So industry with a 34% movement onto the income supports. But what you might notice there with industry, so the grey at the top represents the TWSS. So with those who moved on to income supports in industry, there's actually a greater distribution there, greater share moving on to the temporary wage subsidy scheme. Whereas construction and accommodation and food at that time were more reliant on the pandemic unemployment payment. You'll probably also note sectors there which were less affected. So information, communications and technology is about 20% worth. That sector has obviously been more resilient because due to their ability to work from home and their reliance on data, it's been less affected. Sorry, their reliance on technology, it's been less affected than some of the other sectors. So looking at the same chart, but more recently. So as we saw from the first kind of high level chart that I showed, there has been a significant movement off these income supports, particularly driven by the PUP. So in terms of what that looks like, we now have approximately 580,000 people been supported by the PUP or the TWSS. So that's down from just over 1 million in the last slide. The sectors affected, though there have been significant decreases in the numbers being supported, the same sectors remain to be the worst affected. So you can still see accommodation and food there as the most affected. However, whereas before there was around 90% being supported, we now are down to about 66%. And of course, most people will be aware that is one of the sectors which some of the enterprise-based there, the wet pubs, are still experiencing lockdown measures. The next most affected sector currently is the admin and support sector. So there's 40% now on the PUP or the TWSS, but that's down from 65% at the peak. And what you might notice with this chart, and is worth pointing out, is that the temporary wage subsidy scheme is now more prominent than the pandemic unemployment payment, which is a positive thing in terms of the relationship between the employee and the employer, which would hope that would be maintained. Whereas the PUP, there's less of a relationship with the former employer is implied for those on the PUP. Just wanted to show this table here. So there's a lot of information in here, but I'm going to whittle it down now just to take you through why we put this together. So you can see that we've looked at the labor market effects on the different sectors, but if we want to think about other economic indicators, this table was quite useful at the outset. So let's take the example of industry here. So we can see that it's a very significant player in the labor market, 12% of share in employment. A lot of the employees are actually in larger firms, so 28% of these employees are in firms of under 50. This industry has a huge share of GVA. We can see it's much bigger than any of the other sectors, 36%. And it's also got a quite large share of tax revenue through income tax and corporation tax. So we can see that it's a very important player in terms of GDP and a very important player in terms of the labor market also. If we take the accommodation and food sector, we can see that it's quite an important player in the labor market with 8% of employment. However, if we look at some of the other indicators, we can see that it's a very low share of GVA and a very low share of tax revenue as well. And we had access to this information before some of the statistics and information started coming out on the tax take and GDP. But I think what we can see in the information that is now coming out in the tax take and GDP is that those two things are perhaps less affected than the impact on the labor market would have suggested. And we could foresee a bit of that in terms of how you could break down the sectoral effects of the PUP and the TWSS. So just conclude before moving on to the next presentations, which will go into the kind of gorier details of the two schemes. So temporary income support measures brought in very quickly to deal with sharp and severe shock to the labour market, and the enterprise supports are also important in terms of how their indirect, slightly indirect effect on supporting the labour market through supporting the enterprise base. Massive movement onto these income supports at a peak of 1.3 million on the PUP and TWSS and the live register by mid-May. We've seen that there has been improvement, mostly driven by a reduction in the PUP. So it's currently around 856,000 people on the PUP, TWSS and live register, though as Jasmina alluded to at the beginning, it's perhaps not the V-shaped recovery that was hoped for a couple of months ago, and that's obviously due to the way that the pandemic has progressed. So at the peak, worst affected sectors, when we break it down by sectors, accommodation and food at 90% of people moving on to the income supports, construction 81%, admin and support and retail also had significant movement onto the PUP and the TWSS. Those sectors have still remained among the worst affected. Maybe there's been a slight shift, but still accommodation and food at 66% is the worst affected. Construction is probably also worth pointing out, still 30% on income supports, and that was a sector in particular it was hoped could recover quite quickly due to the nature of the work, and it was amongst one of the first to reopen. However, still 30% of the previous workforce on the PUP or TWSS. The movement off the PUP has slowed a bit in the last number of weeks, and I think we'll see a bit more of that in the following presentations. And I guess the longer we go on, it's unknown how quickly the remainder on the PUP can move back into work. There's obviously the wet pubs, which are still to reopen, and that should cause some kind of movement. But it's anticipated that there could be some quite sticky cases left on the PUP. And then lastly, just to say, yeah, it's important to consider the different economic contributions of the sectors. You know, we had data on that before some of the new statistics started to come out, but I think this has been reflected in the tax receipts and GDP impacts, which have been relatively less affected than the apparent impact on the labour market. Yeah, so I'll leave it there, and we'll hand over to the next presenter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cathal. That gives us a good overview of the kind of the high level situation in the labour market and the income supports. We move on now to Ailbhe Brioscu from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. Ailbhe is also an IGEES economist. She's working in the Activation and Employment Policy Unit, and she's grappling with the policy side, so the response to this crisis, and specifically she's working on the Pathways to Work strategy and the departmental Brexit preparations, and she also supports the work of the Labour Market Advisory Council. So over to you, Ailbhe.
Thank you, Jasmina. I'm just going to share my screen now. So thanks everyone. As Jasmina said, my name is Ailbhe Brioscu and I'm an IGEES economist at the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. And obviously I'm going to be presenting on the COVID-19 pandemic and the labour market, but looking specifically at the analysis of PUP recipients. So just to give a quick overview of the onset of the pandemic and the associated restrictions and policy measures that ensued. The pandemic, as we know, was an abrupt and adverse shock to both the economy and the society. And in less than 2 weeks after Ireland's first confirmed case of COVID-19, the government announced the closure of all education and childcare facilities on March 12th. Additional restrictions on pubs and hotels quickly followed, with the government acting quickly to introduce both the pandemic unemployment payment and the employer refund scheme, which ultimately became the TWSS. At the end of April, over 1.1 million people were in receipt of state supports to the labour market, with the COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate peaking at 28.2% in April. And just to give some background info on some earlier research that we had done, in early May, we published a paper on the initial impacts of the pandemic on the labour market in collaboration with the Central Bank of Ireland. And from this research, we found that on the basis of jobs lost, or you could say jobs displaced, the most severely impacted sectors were tourism, hospitality and food, retail and construction, and that those who had lost their jobs were more likely to be young, low-skilled and previously in part-time employment than the population average, which really reflects the higher share of these kinds of workers in the most affected sectors. And now just to give a quick overview of the kind of headline trend seen as Ireland has started to reopen its economy and society again. Those sectors that were most disrupted by the pandemic and the containment measures saw the largest inflows to the PUP. So you can see these three sectors, the three worst affected sectors in the initial impacts here in red. So as the economy has continued to open, these sectors have now seen the highest levels of claims closed on the PUP. There are now 219,000 people in receipt of the PUP as of today, a 63% reduction from the May 5th peak. Revenue also estimate that there are approximately 360,000 people currently supported by the TWSS, with 242,000 individuals moving from the TWSS to non-subsidised employment to date. As we can see here, as the country has moved through the reopening phases, a significant increase in claims closed to work has been seen, with the July COVID adjusted unemployment rate reaching 16.7%. So this COVID adjusted measure of unemployment considers PUP recipients to be counted as unemployed in the calculation. So the momentum in claims closed or outflows to work is anchored really to the reopening phases. And we can see these claims closed to work represented by the orange line. So the majority of outflow activity in the sectors is primarily during and also sometimes immediately prior to their given reopening phase. We can also see that although reopening under the original roadmap has almost been paused, consistent exits to work are still being seen on a weekly basis. And moreover, the timeline here highlights some of the key policy developments that have come on stream in recent months, including the introduction of the two-tier PUP payment rate in June, which Cathal mentioned earlier, and the extension of the payment under the July job stimulus package. So now we're just going to enter the second part of this presentation, and we're going to really look at the reopening impacts, and looking particularly at phase 1 and phase 2 of the reopening roadmap in particular, and profiling those that have returned to work. And by exits or returns to work in this section of the presentation, we're referring to those who have had a PUP claim, have subsequently closed the claim, and have entered returning to work as their reason for doing so. So here we can see the sectoral composition of phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work. The trends we really see here are ultimately a function of the details of the individual reopening phases. So construction here has the largest volume of PUP exits to work in phase 1, and this was the phase that allowed for the reopening of this sector. Wholesale and retail also had large outflows in both phase 1 and phase 2, as these phases allowed for retail outlets that had been closed under containment measures to reopen. So this shows us the gender breakdown of phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work. If we think back to the peak of PUP recipients at May 5th, males accounted for roughly 57% of total recipients, whereas phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work have been more heavily populated by males, as we see here by the green bars. This is accounted for by the overall larger male population, both on the payment and in some of the main sectors that reopened under the 2 phases. So construction would be an example here of a sector that has a large underlying male population, and therefore led to the larger outflows of males in phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work. It is also interesting to look at the variation in age profiles of our phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work. Our phase 1 exits to work, which are represented by the green line, as you can see, are more centered around the prime working age bracket, whereas our phase 2 exiters, represented in gold, have a higher proportion of younger individuals. Phase 2 saw all retail outlets reopen, a sector in which larger volumes of younger people both work and in turn had been in receipt of the PUP. Irish nationals have and continue to make up the largest share of PUP recipients in terms of nationality. Therefore, in terms of both phase 1 and phase 2 exits, the vast majority of these have been Irish nationals. However, as you can see here, broad and even exits to work across nationality groups were seen in both phase 1 and phase 2 of reopening. In terms of the regional profile of phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work were seen across all regions and were relatively evenly spread across the 2 phases. The distribution of exits across regions is roughly proportional to the regional spread of PUP recipients that we would have seen at the peak in May 5th, highlighting that returns to work in these phases were felt across all regions. And finally, for this section of the presentation, looking at the earnings profile of phase 1 and phase 2 exits to work, phase 2 exits had a higher share of recipients with previous weekly earnings at the lower end of the income distribution. The share of lower earnings aligns with the fact that phase 2 exits had a higher share of younger individuals, more likely to be in lower paid and part-time employment. So now just moving on to the final part of our presentation, we're going to be looking at those currently in receipt of the PUP. And this analysis is as of week 35, or those receiving the payment in the week of September 1st, which was last week. Here we are looking at the rate of payment across current recipients across age groups. We can see that the majority of individuals are receiving the higher rate of payment. So this is represented by the gold bar, this higher rate of payment being €350 per week. And the largest cohort in receipt of the lower rate of pay, €203 per week, are those younger individuals. So yet again, this is a cohort which is more likely to have previously been in lower paid and part-time employment before entering the PUP. Looking at the overall age profile of current PUP recipients, I think it's quite useful if we look at the kernel density plot on the right. This shows the high proportion of younger individuals remaining on the payment at present. Moreover, if we compare our current recipients, which are the line in red, to those who have exited the scheme at any point in time, represented by the green line, we can see that our exiters are more likely to be prime working age, with higher proportions of younger and older workers remaining on the payment. Here we can see durations on the PUP of current recipients. So this shows an individual's duration in weeks. This chart shows us that the vast majority of current recipients have been receiving the payment since the initial weeks of the scheme. So this trend in long durations on average is consistent across age groups, as we can see here, where the median duration is approximately 22 weeks. Similarly, across nationality groups, we can see here that the median duration across nationality groups is even at approximately 22 weeks again. And finally, here we see a kernel density plot of average weekly earnings of current recipients at the peak at May 5th, and those who have exited the PUP to work to date. So we can see that those remaining on the scheme are more likely to have had quite low previous earnings compared to both our exiters and those on the payment at the peak. So now just to briefly conclude and summarise some of the key takeaways from our analysis, the reopening of the economy and the resulting exits to work from the PUP have led to shifts in the underlying stock of PUP recipients. We found that although there is a constant churn of inflows and outflows from the scheme, the majority of current recipients have been in receipt of the payment since the very first weeks of the scheme. And this trend is broadly consistent across age groups, sectors, nationality and sex. Compared to current recipients, those who have exited the PUP to work are more likely to have been classified as prime working age and typically have higher earnings. The larger share of younger and older workers remaining on the payment provides us insight into the potential challenge to be faced by the Public Employment Service. We will need to ensure that these cohorts are given the best possible chance to get back to work. Looking forward, it is worth noting that while economic conditions rapidly deteriorated at the hands of the pandemic, it cannot be assumed that the same pace can be applied to the recovery phase. However, of the economic forecast conducted to date, all point to the idea that we have already experienced a peak in unemployment. And this has been reinforced by the significant decline in both PUP recipients and in the COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate to date. So thank you. I'm going to hand over now to the next speaker.
Thank you, Ailbhe. So that obviously gives us a good sense of the improvements in terms of the exits from the pandemic unemployment payment, but also tells us about the size of the challenge and the people who remain and some of those who have been on the payment for a long time and who they are. So we move now to the next presentation, which is Orlagh Lavelle. And Orlagh is also an IGEES policy analyst. She works in the Department of Social Protection Vote in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. And she is grappling with the idea of how much of all of this costs and what is the impact on the exchequer of these supports that we have in place. And as we look forward, and the situation is improving, but not at the speed that we were hoping for, and we're looking at Brexit as well, and you know, what does that mean from the exchequer's perspective? So over to you, Orlagh.
Thanks, Jasmina, and thanks to the DUE committee for organising this session as well. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so just a quick overview of what I'll be speaking about today. I'm going to look at the expenditure impact to date. I'm going to look at some of the numbers involved, which were highlighted earlier, some of the key impacts of this shock, and some of the implications of that as well going forward, and then some of the interactions between the TWIS and the PUP that Cathal touched on earlier as well. So just a quick overview of the expenditure to date. I mean, it's obviously been very significant. We've had 3 new temporary schemes, the PUP, the Temporary Wage Subsidy Scheme, the Enhanced Illness Benefit Scheme, and then we've had obviously additional live register numbers as well, which has cost implications. So like in total, to date, as of yesterday, we've spent on these schemes 6.4 billion. So like a really significant amount of expenditure, but also, you know, the numbers supported have been very significant as well and continue to remain significant. So like going forward, the expenditure implications will continue. At the peak, we were spending about 400 million a week on these schemes. That's fallen down to 170 million a week, predominantly because the numbers have reduced, but also, you know, changes to the PUP payment rates also, but it's still a significant amount of money to be spending. and obviously that has implications for sustainability of expenditure and also the opportunity costs as we go forward into the recovery and promoting kind of new employment and jobs. So Cathal touched on this as well. Just the numbers have fallen significantly but remain really high that are being supported. At the moment, it's about 34% of the labour force that are receiving either an unemployment payment or are being subsidised in their employment. So the numbers on PUP have obviously fallen and TWIS has stayed very static. You know, there's been a 50,000 drop in the TWIS, but actually, you know, relatively, it's been fairly small, but there's been huge transfers of people going into TWIS from PUP and people exiting TWIS as well that you don't see at the aggregate level, but are actually occurring on a weekly basis. The expectation is that those numbers, you know, the numbers overall supported will continue to fall, but actually at a much slower rate, and we're already starting to see that now. And I think the next slide really demonstrates this. Obviously, the phased reopenings under the roadmap have resulted in peaks of claims closures in the PUP, but actually in the last 7 weeks, things have stayed the claims close have reduced significantly and really fallen down into much more stable kind of recovery declines. And that's true across all sectors. Actually, even last week's or yesterday's figures, we're seeing a couple of hundred coming off on construction, but 17,000 still being supported on the PUP. Similarly, manufacturing, just 200 coming off last week. So things are starting to, you know, the rate of reduction is really starting to slow now, and it just highlights the sort of challenge ahead that, you know, despite the huge numbers that have fallen off on these supports, there's still a high number that are being supported and will continue to be supported going forward as well. You know, when we compare this unemployment crisis to kind of previous unemployment crisis, you know, some similarities can be drawn, but by and large, this is kind of unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's bigger, it was faster. The peaks, there was much bigger peaks. Like at the moment, there's still about 19% of the labour force classified as unemployed when you combine the live register and the PUP. And by and large, like previously, you know, at the actual peak of people being supported, you know, they weren't necessarily unemployed. They were waiting for, you know, the economy to reopen. Whereas now, by and large, most of the economy has reopened. These people we can really consider to be unemployed, and they've been unemployed for 6 months. The live registers also continue to increase quite rapidly, actually, compared to like the 2008 crisis. It took 3.5 years before we reached a peak. This time it's been 2 months. So at the moment we have like 84% of the actual people that we can classify as unemployed, I suppose. They're short-term unemployed, but you know, as I said, they've been unemployed for 6 months. In another 6 months, they'll be classified as long-term unemployed, a year out of work, with all the potential scarring effects and the challenges faced for that cohort, and particularly thinking of the sectors that they've come from and that they've the kind of vulnerabilities as well going forward. So I want to touch on some of the characteristics of the people most impacted. So there's been lots of discussion on like who has been most impacted, some of the sectors that Cathal has spoken about, and as Ailbhe touched on, the kind of young demographic. Broadly, like on volume terms, the numbers on PUP are similar, but actually when you break it down by like relative to the actual labour force for that age group, it's definitely emerging. You know, the younger people under 25s have been disproportionately affected. 16% of the under 25 labour force is on the PUP. That's almost double that of the 25 to 34 year age group. So we are seeing some of that, you know, that disproportionate impact there. But also it's worth kind of noting from a policy perspective, but also when you think about kind of trajectory going forward on employment outcomes, that the under 25, like unlike classic job seeker income support, the PUP is eligible. Full-time students that were working part-time are eligible for the PUP payment. So, you know, it's likely driving some of that impact, and it's worth kind of considering that when you think of employment outcomes. And there's no oversight on how many people or full-time students, part-time worker are in that are in the PUP at the moment, just by the nature of the PUP form. They don't collect the data on that, but I would imagine a fairly high proportion of the under 25s on the lower rate, for example, would be of that cohort, but it's impossible to know. Just something to consider. When you look at, I suppose the pre-COVID average net income also kind of shows some differences regarding kind of scheme take-up, but also how things have kind of recovered for different people within the same sector. When you look at the TWIS pre-COVID average net income to the PUP recipients, and within the same sector, by and large, the TWIS recipients tended to be higher earners than the PUP recipients, and I think that just demonstrates that people tended to go to schemes that they had the greatest kind of financial drawdown. PUP recipients tended to be the lower earners, so that 350 flat rate had a bit of an incentive effect there. But then when you look at kind of the P recipients over time and looking at that income, their income has actually fallen quite significantly as the PUP numbers have fallen off. So that kind of just highlights the PUP exits to date have been the higher earners within that sector. So it means that the PUP people remaining on PUP at the moment within a particular sector are the lower earners in that sector. And by and large, the numbers on PUP have been in the most vulnerable sectors, and now they're the most vulnerable people in those most vulnerable sectors, I suppose, most exposed sectors, shall we say. Highlight the sort of challenges going forward and sort of potential recovery paths in the months, years, decades ahead, potentially. So again, I just want to touch on some of the other characteristics. That are the regional component is interesting, especially going forward, thinking about Brexit as well. Initially, there was kind of differences, again, with kind of take up. We saw kind of more rural counties, bigger take up on the PUP from like rural counties when you adjust for kind of working age populations. And TWIS was very much more like Dublin centric, bigger take ups there. But actually, from the most recent data from yesterday, we've actually, it's not demonstrated on the map here, but when you look at it, you'll actually see, which makes sense, as TWIS, the distribution of TWIS across counties is similar now to what we saw in PUP earlier on. And that makes sense because obviously we've seen huge numbers of people exiting PUP and going on to TWIS. So those characteristics are being brought forward when you look at the TWIS kind of distribution on a regional level as well. But interesting to see kind of the differences initially in the take-up across counties. So now I'm going to kind of touch on some of that interactions and the sort of exits. We don't see it at aggregate level, but there's huge churn within these schemes like each week, and at aggregate the cumulative effects have been really significant. And we mentioned the TWIS, not much movement or very little decrease since its initiation, but actually the outflows from TWIS since its initiation has been over 300,000. So that's really significant outflows from that scheme. Thankfully, there's been very few outflows into the PUP payment. So that's kind of a positive sign. So just over 23,000 have left TWIS, gone into the PUP. The majority of those exits from TWIS have been to non-TWIS employment, which again is highlighting, some good labour market functioning or normal labour market functioning, as people have no longer needed the subsidy and have been able to go return to like non-subsidised employment, for example. And then we've also seen obviously a lot of PUP exits going into TWIS employment, but also to non-TWIS employment. Again, there is still signs of like normal labour market functioning despite the huge supports that have been required and have been maintained over the last few months. But the TWIS has definitely become, as Cathal touched on, the biggest kind of support available, as the PUP has been kind of, people have exited the PUP and went into the TWIS. This has become such a major support for employees, employers and business. So when you look at those exits by sector, now this is just a note, from May to August, so it doesn't capture the full outflows, but when you look at the PUP exits into the twist by sector, you know, you're seeing kind of the patterns emerging. It's the most vulnerable people, people in sectors that are entering or exiting PUP and going into the twist. So accommodation and food, retail, construction, they've been the big entries into twist from PUP. And then similarly, when you look at kind of the top ups of those sectors, so the employers topping up that subsidy for their employees, again, it's the same kind of sectors. Accommodation and food and construction are pretty high on the no top up. So like 30% of that accommodation and food employees weren't receiving a top up. It just kind of demonstrates potentially some sort of issues with viability going forward. Is something to keep an eye on as well, I suppose, particularly as we go into like EASP, as the EASP scheme comes into play. So yeah, finally, I'll just finish up with some of the kind of key messages. Really, obviously, the expenditure to date has been really significant, 6.4 billion and growing, and the numbers supported have been really high, and the declines have been falling. So we can expect this expenditure implications to remain really high, and all issues around sustainability going forward as well. The roadmap has resulted obviously in huge declines, but again, you know, the numbers being supported remain really high. Some of the characteristics coming through, the unemployed are kind of much more short term at the moment, pretty strong labour market attachment for now, but you know, in 6 months' time, you know, they'll be classified as long term, a year out of work, and all the challenges that will come with that. We also now have an in-employment cohort that are being supported, 360,000 individuals being supported on the wage subsidy scheme, and then with the EASP, a number of people will continue to be supported under that as well. And again, the sort of young people, rural aspect coming through around impacts as well. But some normal labour market functioning, with the numbers moving off twists, continuing to grow each week, which is a positive sign. Going forward then, I suppose the biggest challenges are the volume of people that are on these supports. The demand for, you know, activation supports going forward will all occur at the same time, and effective responses and management of that will require the targeting of the most appropriate supports to those job seekers. We're in a slightly better position than we were in the 2008 crisis. We have significant learnings from that crisis. We also have a lot of the structures in place. We know what works and what doesn't. So that is of benefit, but the number being supported is the huge challenge going ahead. And John will touch on in the next presentation some of these kind of the activation policy side and the public employment services going ahead. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Orlagh. So certainly sobering numbers, almost 6.5 billion in expenditure on these schemes. Still numbers quite high. Facing Brexit, we're likely to see these elevated numbers going forward. Young cohorts, Orlagh raising some issues there around incentives to work, and whether, you know, the way we're intervening in the labour market is affecting those. So very good overview, lots of statistics, lots of data. We have a pretty good handle now in IGEES across all of this analysis of what the size of the challenge is. So this brings us very nicely into kind of what do we do about this. So John Martin is going to talk to us about the active labour market policies and how we can tackle the challenge. Delighted to have John talk to us. He has a huge experience in this area. He's former Director for Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD. So he studied in UCD in Oxford and started his career in the SRI. And then he also worked in Oxford and University of Buckingham, his academic career, but then he joined OECD, where he had a very long and distinguished career. He was a founding editor of the OECD Employment Outlook and a member of both editorial board for OECD Economic Studies and Labour Economics. And he was also the OECD Sherpa for the G20 Labour Ministerial Process. He was associated with numerous international bodies, University of Nottingham, University for Study of Labour in Bonn, advisor to the French Prime Minister, the Paris Institute of Political Studies, to name a few. And then in Ireland, associated with the work of the UCD Geary Institute, Irish Labour Market Council, the National Statistics Board of Ireland, and he's now the chair of the Irish Government's Labour Market Advisory Council. In 2013, John was awarded the Presidential Distinguished Service Award for the Irish abroad by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. So John, we're delighted to have you talk to us about what the long experience that you have in the area of the labour market and dealing with unemployment can tell us about how we go forward and face the challenge. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Jasmina. I hope everybody can see my presentation. Is it up? Yes. So I want to begin my presentation today with a disclaimer. The views that I will be expressing today are my own, and they shouldn't be taken to represent those of the Labour Market Advisory Council or its other members. And in the presentation, I hope you can all see it. Is it up? Great, here we are. I want to focus on what I see as 6 major challenges facing active labour market policies and activation in Ireland, arising from the unprecedented hike in unemployment following the pandemic and the radical move to put much of the economy into lockdown to stem the virus. So I'm going to cover 6 challenges in this presentation. And the first that I want to start with is, I think, a very important one, which is, I believe that given the starting point that we're facing, Ireland needs to ramp up its public spending effort on active labour market policies and activation greatly. Because if you look at the starting point before this crisis, Ireland was a below average spender, public spender on active labour market policies and activation. In 2018, which is the latest year for which we have comparable data, Ireland spent just over 0.3% of GDP on ALMPS activation. By way of comparison, the Nordic countries, for which we are often compared with, spent between 3 and 6 times as much on ALMPs as a percent of GDP. And in the crisis years of 2009 to 2012, we spent on average about 0.9% of GDP per year before the spending on active labour market policies dropped off sharply as the economy recovered and unemployment dropped steadily. So in my view, given the rapidity and size of the hike in unemployment that the economy has experienced, and the likelihood that it will take quite some time to reduce that unemployment back to what we would regard as more acceptable levels, I think we need to ramp up public spending rather quickly, perhaps to the order of 1% of GDP or more. Now, the July spending package did increase spending on ALMPs but it was a fairly small increase, adding around just over 200 million to ALMPs over the next 18 months. Now, arguing the case for a large hike in spending, we have to be able to justify it. Could such a large increase in public funding on ALMPs be justified? And my answer to that question is, I think we can give a very positive answer thanks to the evidence base on the effectiveness of public spending on active labor market policies. There is a really large and growing international literature on the rigorous evaluations of ALMPs, telling us what works, what doesn't work, and for which groups. Now, Ireland has lagged behind many other OECD countries in the evaluations of active labor market policies until fairly recently. But thanks in part to an initiative which was taken by the predecessor to the Labour Market Advisory Council, the Department of Social Protection and SOLAS and the Department of Education have invested quite a lot in the rigorous evaluations of many of our ALMPs. These studies undertaken using state-of-the-art methods, both quantitative impact evaluations and qualitative surveys of the key actors. These have been undertaken by the ESRI, by Indicon, and by various academics. And the advantage of many of the recent ones is that the mixture of quantitative and qualitative assessments, I think, is very important, because the quantitative impact assessments enable us to answer the what question. What were the program outcomes for participants compared with the stated goals? And the qualitative surveys are very useful in answering the why question. Why did a particular active labor market policy measure work or not work for the participants? Now on the slide, I've listed some of the major ALMPs that work according to the recent evaluations. These include the post-leaving certificate courses, specific skills training, the back-to-work enterprise allowance, the Jobs Plus, Job Bridge, back-to-work education allowance, and the most recent evaluation, which was of the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Program, the evaluation which was published by the ESRI last week. Now, I also list a number of major active labor market policy measures in Ireland that did not work. These include the Back to Education Allowance and the Vocational Training Opportunity Schemes. These are two quite large and very long-standing active labor market policies. Finally, I've put a question mark over community employment, which indeed is our largest single active labor market policy measure in terms of spending and participant measures. The international consensus from the evaluation literature is that such public sector job creation programs rarely work in terms of the employment objectives for clients. There are a few Irish evaluations of community employment, but they're very out of date. So I think it ought to be a priority to evaluate it again rigorously to see whether it does indeed pass muster in terms of cost effectiveness and the benefits to society and the communities. Now, one key factor in the delivery of active labor market policies activation is the caseworkers in the public employment service, or whether a caseworker also works for a private employment services. And there's very good evidence from a number of countries, notably Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, which were able to link caseworkers in individual public employment service offices to their clients' outcomes, that caseworkers can make a real difference. Their approaches to their clients and their experiences matter. And indeed, the social inclusion and community activation program evaluation shows a similar outcome for long-term unemployed clients in Ireland, where a one-to-one relationship with the long-term unemployed on the part of the caseworker and crucial links to local labour markets were vital to good outcomes. So faced with the prospects of huge inflows to unemployment, several countries, Germany, France, and the UK, have announced plans to recruit and train many new caseworkers for their public employment services. Indeed, the UK Treasury and the Department of Work and Trends have announced plans to double the number of Job Centre Plus staff by the end of this year. Now, the international evidence suggests that an ideal caseworker-client workload ratio should be in the range of about 100 to 150. Now, that really raises the question about whether Intrio, the Irish Public Employment Service, has sufficient experienced caseworkers to cope with this huge increase in client inflows that we have seen in the previous presentations. And even allowing for the fact that the Intrio caseworkers will be supplemented by other caseworkers in other employment service providers, I think the question still remains, how many new hires is it planning to make to meet the increased demand? Another important question, I think, is when is it vital, or when is it going to be optimal to step up activation efforts? And by activation, I mean job search assistance, counseling and monitoring, backed by a sanctions threat. Now, the international evaluation evidence shows that activation is a cost-effective active labor market policy. But it's hard to implement effectively following the huge hike in unemployment due to COVID, because the most urgent needs facing the public employment service obviously were to process the inflows quickly and ensure that the unemployed got their benefits on time. But it's not a good idea, in my view, to put off activation on hold for too long. And as soon as the labor market recovers, as soon as hirings and vacancies start to increase again, then the unemployed should be referred to existing vacancies and also to available active labor market policy slots. And as we've seen from the presentations by Orlagh and Ailbhe, the labor market is already beginning to recover. Finally, it would be, I think, important to develop the use of digital tools online to help minimize health risks and enable the caseworkers in the public employment service to devote more time and effort to counseling, monitoring their clients, especially those who are at high risk. One big worry, which has been highlighted by both Ailbhe and Orlagh, is the risk of a lost COVID generation as school leavers and other young people hit the labor market at the worst moment. And we know from the literature on past recessions that scarring effects are large and long-lasting for many new entrants and young people. And we also know that among the cohort of young people, those with low education skills coming from disadvantaged families and localities are at the highest risk of long-term unemployment or of not being in education, employment, or training. Now, many young people will simply postpone labor force entry by staying on in education and training. But many of them will not have and those who opt to join the labor market, we will need to put in place, in my view, a revamped and greatly expanded work placement internship scheme along the lines of JobBridge. Now, I know that JobBridge had a bad press and was closed down, but this is in spite of the fact that a rigorous evaluation of JobBridge by Indicon showed that it worked very well for participants, a finding that is in fact rather rare in the international literature on evaluations on ALMPs targeted to young people. It would obviously be desirable to increase apprenticeship slots for this generation of new entrants, but it's going to be very hard to persuade firms to offer a sufficient number of them when they are faced with such uncertain demand prospects. In my view, expanding apprenticeships in the current circumstances is unlikely to be very successful unless the public subsidy is increased significantly. And it may well be that hiring subsidies targeted to disadvantaged young people would be a better bet in the present circumstances. It would be very important to fight against a resurgence of long-term unemployment, but it is inevitable from the dynamics of the labor market that long-term unemployment is going to increase sharply over the next 2 years. And it's vital to target those most at risk of long-term unemployment using the PECS profiling model adapted to the current labor market situation. Intensive interventions can work for the long-term unemployed. This was one of the keys to the CCAP success, but this demands heavily experienced caseworkers, the ability to tackle the underlying health, skills, and other disadvantages that many of the long-term unemployed have, and also to exploit strong ties to local labor markets. But we can't rely on Intreo alone to supply these kinds of services, so that we will need to continue to contract for-profit and not-for-profit employment service providers to assist the long-term unemployed to find work. These providers have valuable expertise and local offices, and the job path and CCAP evaluations show that they can work. Now, it may well be that the contracts with these providers may need to be reviewed in order to ensure that they have sufficient incentives to assist their clients avoid cherry picking and parking. And of course, it will be vital to enhance the digital skills for many of those at high risk of long-term unemployment. So SOLAS and the Education and Training Boards will have a vital role to play here, and to ensure that the training offers are closely linked to local labor market needs. So my final conclusions, I think, are rather clear. I think it's urgent to expand significantly public spending on active labor market policies. I think we have a good evidence base on which programs will work and which will not. It will be important to hire and train more caseworkers for the public employment service, and to invest more in online services. As the labor market recovers, the intensity of activation efforts must be stepped up, and young people and those at the high risk of long-term unemployment must be given priority. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, John. It's great to get the overview of experiences of other countries and studies and all that evidence of what works and where we should kind of focus our efforts. But I just wanted to maybe start the discussion by asking you, because the first thing that came to my mind, you know, you're saying we need to invest more. There's more money called to invest across the variety of things that you spoke about, increase the number of caseworkers and their ability to engage on a kind of a one-to-one basis and so on. So it's a significant resource. And we just heard from Orlagh that we are spending 6.5 billion, that we have spent 6.5 billion on income supports. Could you comment on how income supports and, you know, the active labour market policies, how do they, in your view, interact? And if you could reflect as well on the incentives to work and for people who are on these supports to actually engage with all of the stuff that you've been talking about.
Yes, thank you very much, Jasmina. I mean, I think that is a very important issue that you've just raised. Of course, we've spent, and many other countries have spent, a huge amount on income support to try to cushion the impact on household incomes. But as we know, it's not going to be, and the biggest single one we now face is, of course, moving people onto the employment wage subsidy scheme. But we know that we can't keep such large numbers of people on these schemes indefinitely. A, the subsidy implicit on the subsidy on the public purse would be so large, and B, we would be keep subsidizing firms to keep workers in jobs that are not viable over the medium term. So it's important to encourage a flow of people to get the labour market moving again, to get people moving off the unemployment register and into new jobs. And that's where the active labour market policies come into play. And in my view, if they're implemented appropriately with a satisfactory degree of activation, this should serve to minimize any work disincentive effects that might arise. As I said, activation has to have both a carrot and a stick. The carrot has to be effective active labour market policies that will help people find new jobs or improve their employability. The stick has to be the threat of a benefit sanction if the individual in question is not actively looking for work or actively taking steps to improve their employability. Now, striking that balance is a very important issue.
Thanks, John. And I'd be interested to hear what Orlagh and Ailbhe and Cathal might think about, you know, the interaction between the existing supports that are there in terms of income supports and, you know, the policies that we already have and that we have developed in terms of active labour market policies, given the previous crisis that we had, and that question of incentive to work. And, you know, what are your views in relation to that? Maybe over to you, Orlagh.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmina. I suppose, yeah, like the public spending on active labour market policies and on employment supports generally has fallen a lot in recent years, but it's a reflection of the previous labour market. I think something that is very key is that that sort of expenditure isn't static. It's supposed to be, it has to be flexible. And that's something that we grappled with in the previous crisis. The supports weren't readily available, structures had to be put in place. JobPath wasn't initiated until mid-2015. It was almost too late then, the contracts have been drawn up. So it's about spending money at the right time and ensuring that's the expenditure and also the supports are flexible to increases in demand, but also as the economy recovers and the labour market improves, that those supports are withdrawn to fund other areas. But I would completely agree with John that carrot and stick is crucial, and the evidence shows that you need to have a strong incentive, financial incentive to work, but also have kind of sanctions for people who are not pursuing employment full time. That also kind of brings up the issue that I just mentioned, that kind of full-time student part-time worker issue on the PUP. And and that has kind of implications as well going forward from a migration to standard welfare. But yeah, agree with kind of John's obviously theories and everything. Yeah.
Thank you, Orlagh. I see a few questions here coming through in relation to the question of moving people into jobs and the kind of the low skilled, just moving them into employment that again might be short term, and you know, are we really solving problems there for the low skilled? And you know, is it just about putting people into jobs that might be, you know, precarious in some way, or you know, in terms of, you know, the tenure and pay and so on, as opposed to, you know, trying to have a longer term approach? And I would be just curious to see, John, what do you think about that question around just, you know, we need to put people straight into jobs, but if they're low skilled, how, you know, are we really solving the problem in the long run, and particularly if they're young?
Well, Jasmina, this is a very difficult issue. I mean, one of the findings from the evaluation literature is that activation does get people off the unemployment register into jobs, but there is a question mark about the kind of jobs that people get and the degree to which they are enabled to pursue career prospects in employment. I think that's a big issue, all right, particularly for people with low education and low skills. And so I think it's important to focus on, as part of your panoply of active labour market policy measures, to invest heavily in the types of skill upgrading that will produce benefits in terms of employment and wage prospects. It's interesting, for example, in the Irish context, to note that the specific skills training programs which are run, which are typically short-term training programs oriented to specific emerging vacancies in the labour market, perform much better than the Back to Education Allowance, which was basically a scheme whereby people were encouraged to invest full-time in education or training, but for which the evaluation shows that the employment gains were in fact often negative for participants, not positive. So yes, on activation, B, emphasize the right kinds of investment in skills and skills upgrading that can help people get into employment. The third point is that there may be an interest in pursuing employment retention measures. Some countries have said that once you get a person into employment, you should then work with the employer and the person in question to ensure that they can stay in employment for a sustainable period, and that there may be a useful subsidy which can be paid in this area. Now, the literature on this is not as good as, not as large as we would like, but there are some suggestions that it could help.
Thank you, John. There's a question here which I might direct at Ailbhe in relation to self-employed. We haven't really spoke about self-employed. How did they fare in this crisis, and what do you know about them from the data? Ailbhe, could you come in on that?
We have done only some preliminary analysis on this. The majority of individuals on the PUP are, at the minute, are employees rather than self-employed people. In some of the more affected sectors like construction, there would have been maybe slightly higher shares of self-employed individuals coming on stream to income supports then. But no, at present, the numbers of self-employed have gone down, and it's definitely a majority of employees at the minute. But I don't have any, unfortunately, detailed analysis there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that.
Sorry, Jasmina, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute there. There is a question there in relation to the ability of the people who are unemployed now and who are going to be subject to the active labour market policies, and the issue around their ability to actually engage with particular education and training, and maybe move into other sectors and restart their career in a different area. And this is something that Scandinavian countries are often kind of praised about, that their the cognitive skills of the populations they're working with when they're dealing with unemployment are such that allow them to actually transition from sectors and jobs and so on through engagement with education and training. Is there something specific about Ireland in this regard? I don't know. Do we fare well there? John, looking at other countries, what's your experience in our in the ability of people that we're talking about here that are impacted to actually engage in a meaningful way with the system, even if we had the case workers who could engage with them one-on-one and have a good plan for them? Do you think that we are working with a cohort that has those sort of basic skills, literacy, numeracy, digital literacy, and so on?
Well, I think if you look at on average, of course, the fact is that the cohort of new entrants will have better literacy and numeracy skills than previous cohorts. However, within that, there's a big dispersion of skills and numeracy and literacy. And of course, we know that the people who are most at risk of long-term unemployment or of need are those who will have relatively low literacy and numeracy skills. But this is where, Jasmina, I believe that the caseworkers have a very important role to play, particularly in terms of counseling, monitoring, and helping remedy some of these skills deficiencies that the clients will have. And I think that that's one of the key points that I draw from the CCAP evaluation, but also similar evaluations of other programs in other countries, is that the one-to-one interaction with experienced caseworkers who can direct the clients, who can identify their weaknesses, who can identify whether it's a skills weakness or a health or a mental health. Remember, many people in these groups have mental health difficulties. They are then able to orient them to the best remedial providers, whether it's on education and training or whether it's on the health front. That's why I emphasize so much the importance of experienced caseworkers and their one-to-one interactions and their knowledge of local education training providers and the needs of the local labour market. I think these are crucial.
Thank you, John. There's a question here for either Orlagh or Ailbhe in relation to, do we have data on where do people go when they exit schemes, support schemes? Do they go into their old jobs and sectors? Do we have an idea of where do they transition into when they go back into the labour market, that is supported or not supported?
Just to quickly give a brief answer on this, maybe Orlagh might have some additional information. At the minute, that's mainly something that we are trying to get further information on, to know, are the people that are returning to work returning in the same job or a new job, and also are they returning to the same sectors. Unfortunately, that's something that's underway and is something that we plan to do, but perhaps Orlagh might have some insight on the TWSS, but unfortunately that's all I have for now.
Orlagh, do you have any data on from
Revenue do publish on the twist the hires and rehires data by sector, so I don't have it to hand, but that might give some insights. I'm not sure if it's cumulative, but it does break down by sector, hires, rehires. So like, I think or like new hires and rehires, and those differences there by sector. So worth having a look at the revenue publications, and also I think the CSO might be publishing that now as well. So it's worth having a look there. I don't have it to hand, I'm sorry.
Well, thanks for that. Just a question for Cathal, and it's in relation to people. Some people are saying, you know, well, we're talking here about reopening of the economy, numbers are rising of COVID, and you know, when we look at the phases that we're reopening and the lockdown, and you know where we've come from, do you have any kind of insights from looking at the enterprise base and how we emerged from the lockdown, and the kind of looking at the numbers rising? What does that tell you, or what is the concern there?
Yeah, I suppose it's a key question for every country, really. You know, a lot of the analysis that we did around.
If people can mute their mics, because we have a bit of an echo.
Sorry, I hope that's better now. Yeah, it's a key question for most countries. You know, it's the balance between the economic considerations of reopening and the economic activity, and the effect on the number of infections. I suppose a lot of the analysis that we did around the economic impacts was to feed into those decisions. So, you know, a lot of the analysis we did was working with colleagues in the Department for Business Enterprise and Innovation, and the Department of Finance, and the Department of Health, and all these kind of considerations we're going into the same piece of advice. So you know, you need to consider what's going on with the real-time information about the economy and the sectors who can go back to work, and the effect that's having on public finances. But at the same time, you need to weigh up what's happening with the virus and the spread of that. So yeah, I suppose that's the question that's going to have to be constantly grappled with.
Thanks. And just the last question now for John, and it's to do with the caseworkers, and there's a question there suggesting that, you know, in the UK, you know, there might be an experience of kind of approaching, even though there's a kind of intensified service there to help unemployed, that the approach might be more of a kind of one of the suspicion in terms of the person's you know, approach to work, and that it's more the one of the stick. Whereas the questions around, you know, the challenges for low skilled, and particularly as we look at, you know, the issues of the atypical work and the maybe digital economy, and that people may not have the ability to engage with this, and you know, what is your kind of view there on how Irish system is placed, and what should that engagement between the caseworkers really look like to lift those people with low skills and approach them in a positive way, where, you know, you're presenting them with a vision of their career and the supports to actually get them into employment that's sustainable and quality, and so on. I know you already reflected on that in a way, but I think it would be a good way to close the session on just kind of looking at that question, because that is the question. We're going to have low skilled people, many of them may be young, some of them may be in the older cohorts, who are facing at this digital and changing and potentially like a structurally shifted economy, and thinking, well, you know, I'm engaging with this caseworker, but you know, what really is the vision for my career, if any? Sorry, John, I was trying to bring you in there.
Okay, sorry. I think that's a great question, Jasmina. I'll try to answer rather quickly. I think the first thing is that, as I emphasized earlier, activation does depend on a mixture of carrots and sticks. I know some people don't like it. They don't like the idea that you have to have a benefit sanction threat in the background, but I think all the evidence internationally shows that you do have to have that balance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as I've emphasized before, the caseworker role is key. And for caseworkers to be able to devote sufficient time to their clients, particularly those who are low educated, low skills, who have other disadvantages, that means they need to face a reasonably low caseload. If the caseload is too heavy for them, they simply cannot devote enough time to understanding what are the problems that this particular unemployed person has, what are the opportunities that we could deploy to help them remedy their disadvantages. So that is why I keep emphasizing, that the international evidence would suggest that ideal workloads are of the order of 100, 150, perhaps 200 at the maximum. But do we have enough experienced workers in our system to be able to give this kind of service to the people that you're talking about, and many of whom, as I say, have multiple disadvantages? That's why I emphasized in my presentation, the importance of the question, have we plans to put in place enough experienced caseworkers or hire and train new ones, and to be able to work together with caseworkers in the for-profit and not-for-profit employment providers markets? I think that's a really key question, because if the services are overloaded, caseworkers can't do the kind of job that we want them to do. And, the people who will need their services most will suffer.
Thank you, John. And I will have to bring the session to the close. There are further questions. I'm sorry, I can't cover all of them, but it's been an engaged session. Thank you to the speakers, a lot of information. Thank you to those who asked the questions. And I hope you enjoyed the session. I'd like to thank again just the organisers and Dublin Chamber for sponsoring it. And I hope you enjoyed the event today. And I hope to see you all tomorrow at the Brexit session. So thank you and goodbye.